Okay, so I decided on a whim to make this hopefully short video to explain why I'm more hesitant to support ex-Muslim groups, particularly very anti-theistic ex-Muslim groups, like, for example, Armin Navabi's Atheist Republic. And it has less to do with the anti-theism and more the lack of focus on secular and Enlightenment values, I would say. So, to begin with, this is just going to be my personal impressions from my own experience. I don't think it's worth much, honestly. I don't think my opinion on this is really going to be of value to anyone. I'm really just doing this for myself because I wanted to put my thoughts into words. And if it is useful, then maybe someone will find some value in it. I did a nearly 3-hour podcast explanatory where I dove into the Catholic Church's rape crimes to try to articulate why I feel that the global context of the Catholic rape crimes against innocent children seem to just be whitewashed or ignored, and how upset I was over the lack of compassion that I'm seeing, simply because the Catholic Church can claim itself to be a religion, and suddenly it gets this special status to do what it does. We, of course, see the same thing with Islam. I'm not sure if the specific approach that ex-Muslims are currently using is very effective. I mean, from what I've gained from my discussion with Harris Sultan, I'm probably wrong. I probably don't know how effective or how workable their strategies are, and I'm sure that whatever views I hold is mostly out of ignorance for how NGOs and so forth operate and what is the best call for their political goals. So I don't think that whatever I'm going to add here is going to have much value for them. And honestly, I don't think it'll be listened to at all, really. So this is mainly a criticism, mostly focusing on Atheist Republic, but it can overlap with ex-Muslims of North America or the general ex-Muslim community, but the ex-Muslim Western Atheist YouTube community, I should say. I'm sorry if that's a mouthful. Okay, so first up, I feel there's a lot of confirmation bias and circle jerking, for lack of a better term, on negative news, especially with Atheist Republic. They just go through all the negative news on religion, and it just kind of instills a sense of outrage, anger, and a cultish level of just contempt. As much as I hate to admit that, I don't think that it's good to only focus on negative news regarding religion, because that's exclusively zeroing in on the worst case scenarios. And I could see it causing a skewed negative view of religious people in general. Even if, you have religious families, even if you've known people, been part of a congenial religious community all your life, I still think that going through negative news constantly, weekly even, is just not mentally healthy. And it does set a sense of confirmation bias because you are specifically looking for negative news regarding religion, and you don't really give a full picture or a fair shot to any positive aspects that are being adopted or learned. So, and I understand when saying this that too often religious people in general try to dissuade any negatives from religion, usually by moving the goalposts or using the no true Scotsman fallacy, like, oh, that's not the real interpretation of a religion, even after, say, a horrible genocide has happened in the name of faith. But at the same time, I don't think zeroing in on specifically negative events that are religious in nature is helpful either. I feel like that's just an opposite extreme at this point. I mean, I was all for it at first, but when participating with Atheist Republic on the YouTube platform specifically, or just the community in general, it just seems like I wouldn't say that the community is toxic, but that there is a toxic level of contempt for the view of religion as anything else but an anathema that needs to be eradicated, and that anyone who thinks otherwise is just stupid. I do see that. Again, based on my experience. And it's been pretty limited. It's only been like a few months, honestly. So that probably makes it even less valuable than people who've spent several months or even years with that community, and who probably will rebuke me on this point. So the second issue, I brought this up in my blog in a more articulate way. I'm more articulate with writing than I am with speaking on a mic. So I find that the ex-Muslim atheist community, of YouTube platformers on Twitter and so forth, they don't really listen to criticism. They say they're open to criticism. They say they want to challenge their ideas. They don't listen to criticism. They see themselves as having a high ground, a moral high ground, and that any dissent against their moral high ground, especially if you're, say, a conservative and supporting secularism, or a religious person, it could be a Hindu or a Christian, and if you support their arguments for Enlightenment values, secular values, because you agree with them, you'll probably find yourself with a high level of anti-theism, to the point they don't really listen to your arguments. They just see it as a bunch of angry people spewing hate. They poison the well a lot against any detractors, honestly. And then they try to present themselves as on a moral high ground, even when they don't have a moral high ground. Like, the Berlin photo op was just an act of self-sabotage. And throughout it all, every single member of that photo op basically tried to present themselves as, after the fact that they had stood on it, this wasn't even their initial argument on the Twitter pages where discussion happened where Armin ended up losing support on Twitter, according to the people responding to him. But they didn't really see any problem with that, and it seems to me like it doesn't have to be just that specific instance. I mean, for all intents and purposes, maybe they have a point. If they really want to be consistent and just say, this is free speech or free expression, and, we have a right to do it, okay, but that doesn't mean you're not free from being criticized for it. And it seems to me like any time they are criticized at all by someone who isn't an ex-Muslim like them, then they don't really listen. They don't even value it. When VidoVids and Harris Sultan made that response video on VidoVids' channel regarding the Berlin photo op, they seemed to imply any criticism that they received was baseless and tried to suggest, or at least imply, that anyone who was criticizing them for the Berlin photo op had problems, and that there was something either nefarious in their intent or there was something wrong with them. And this seemed to me like a very bizarre sort of juvenile response to controversy. They still seem to maintain this illusion of a moral high ground that wasn't warranted. And it honestly looked like an act of self-sabotage that they were then trying to justify and double down on. And in that same video, Harris Sultan, before my conversation with him, made a statement in that video saying that he didn't want the Hindu nationalist supporters and wanted to get rid of them from his Twitter. He didn't really specify what Hindu nationalists were, what their agenda was, or what their political goals were. He just seemed to view them as some sort of right-wing group, and that was that, as far as his opinion. And even after our conversation, that's exactly what he attempted to do by splurging on Twitter endlessly with the specific statement that he wanted to get rid of these followers. I don't see how that's... I mean, I conversed with him about this for 3 hours. I still don't see how that's useful for any sort of political goals. He has said that it doesn't really impact him or Armin or Vidu or anyone else negatively. So I guess I just don't understand and don't know enough to make any sort of judgment call. But in my personal opinion, it seems like whenever they get into controversy, whenever they put themselves into unnecessary controversy, they don't really care what anyone else thinks about it at all. Even in this context, their fellow ex-Muslims who point out, like, this is going too far. Like, there's battles that need to be fought, such as the defense of ex-Muslim and Muslim human rights. And then there's this, which is so pointless and not really an issue that's necessary to tackle, and if there's any sort of important political goal in mind. It's just being consistent with values for the sake of consistency. And meaningless for any organization that's trying to promote atheist, ex-Muslim, or Muslim human rights. They just, well, it is possible that their friends who are atheists, who are so on and so forth, ex-Hindu, ex-Christian, so on and so forth, they might value their opinions within their close-knit group, but otherwise, I don't really see them valuing any other viewpoints or opinions at all. I'm sorry to say, I don't mean to sound as if I have contempt regarding that. It's more just personal disappointment, really. But that's more on me. And one of the problems I have with that I feel is a huge problem, is that when they push forward with their campaigns, they say, we support secular values, we'll accept support from however many, and we value your opinions, we want to challenge our views. But then when they get that support from religious people who are secular, could be Christian, could be Hindu, could be Jewish, so on and so forth, they're always the religious people, especially if they're conservative, but it could also be liberal, like me. They're just treated as right-wing fanatics who are trying to co-opt their message. It's like, no, that is not what that is not what most of these people are trying to do. And they will use, say, 1 or 2 or maybe even 4 to 6 stupid comments by a Hindu or a Christian or some other religious type of fanatic and say, like, oh, this represents all these people who are trying to follow us. And we don't want your support. Because we support Muslim human rights, but we don't support how you are trying to hurt them. You can't even have a conversation about this, honestly. It's like, we are not trying to hurt Muslims. We actually agree with you, but you don't listen. Moreover, it seems rather ridiculous to me that they constantly use anecdotal evidence and don't really consider the statistical significance of their followers. Like, they could make polls for Hindu or Christian or whatever other religious group specific and ask what they think and how they support the ex-Muslim cause. They don't really attempt to do that. They just assume based on anecdotal comments, and by anecdotal I mean you could honestly have like 40,000 hate comments from a demographic of 200,000, 300,000, and the majority of these people would not be supportive of those negative comments towards ex-Muslims, would not be trying to denigrate ex-Muslims, and would not be trying to co-opt ex-Muslim arguments for any nefarious purpose. The vast majority of the cases, it's probably Christian or Hindu secular people who are religious, agree with secular values, and who want to support ex-Muslim human rights, and not attempting to make any sort of discriminatory comments. But they use the dumbest comments by a Hindu or a Christian and try to make this broad brush of Hindu nationalists or Christian far-right that it is absolutely ridiculous. Like, this is the kind of behavior of juvenile children, using 1 or 2 of the most basest of comments to try and make a widespread generalization of other groups. The same thing that Muslims do to ex-Muslims. That's really it, honestly. That's at least how I've interpreted it, because I tried to spend around 7 months, for example, just telling ex-Muslims of North America and Armin and Ali A. Rizvi that the secular party in India, the Indian National Congress Party, supports Sharia courts, which would be harmful to ex-Muslims in India who are already trying to hide who they are because they fear that their families will kill them, and the police aren't really all that great in terms of police to population ratio in India. So it's unlikely that they can be helpful, unfortunately. And there's already, backlogs of crimes because, densely populated, huge population, so forth. And honestly, it seems particularly ridiculous and even juvenile for them to say, we need support, we agree with all these multifaceted views and so forth, we agree with challenging our views, but then when Hindus or Christians support them and agree with their secular values, they just rebuke it as, oh, these are extremists trying to co-opt our message. And they don't even try to have a conversation. They don't even try to listen to any dissenting views from any religious people who might support them. And then some of them honestly go out of their way to try to get rid of those followers, like Zara K and, I'm sorry to say, Harris Sultan as well. And it's just like, what are you doing? I thought you wanted to be open to conversation. I thought you wanted support. I thought you wanted discussion, dialogue, move these things forward so that we can help support and defend Muslim human rights. Because I thought that was the point. As well as, supporting ex-Muslim human rights, of course. And then there's just this childish response that is... I'm honestly floored by how ridiculous it is. It's like, you would expect this from toddlers, not people trying to push a political agenda in the service of human rights for all people. I mean, I'm honestly flabbergasted by that behavior. It just never made any sense to me, and I don't have anything positive that I can say about it, honestly. Essentially, they go from arguing against tribalism, trying to be above tribalism, with this implied moral high ground. But then, when it comes to support from religious groups who agree with their secular values, they become the most tribalistic and seem to just denigrate any religious person who agrees with their secular values. And it doesn't necessarily have to be religious in the context of believing in a higher power. It could just be someone like me who describes themselves as a Hindu atheist. Like, what are you doing? Did you want dialogue? Did you really want to challenge your views? Did you really want multicultural values? Or do you just think you have the answers and that anyone who doesn't agree with you is an idiot? Because it honestly seems like the latter to me. And it's part of the reason why I don't believe that anything I say here has any value or will be listened to or whatever. I honestly think they don't care. That is the impression I've received after spending over 7 months trying to have conversations being ignored. Like, whenever I made a good point or shared news articles, credible news articles, like, say, from Foreign Policy or New York Times and so forth, people like Armin and Ali A. Rizvi don't listen. Or when I debunked certain arguments, such as the Jai Shri Ram controversy. Now, there was an incident where that a Muslim man was harmed and died in the hospital from an attack by a Hindu mob. That did happen. What didn't happen was this being spread all over India. That was, frankly, a conspiracy, and each of these successive cases reported on the left-leaning media in India were debunked. So it happened once. That was a horrible tragedy. The people who did that should obviously be in jail for killing an innocent man. But in these successive calls, like, Jai Shri Ram mobs, that didn't happen, as far as what I've read. And if there are, other incidents of, like, Jai Shri Ram mobs, I'm obviously not trying to downplay it or to dehumanize Muslims. I'm just saying, like, if there are, I haven't seen any credible ones. Most of the ones that I've read about were debunked. The overwhelming majority of the cases. After that initial horrible incident. So, moving to my next point. Okay, so to talk more about my personal experience with trying to communicate with them, I understand that, they're busy and so forth. And, it's not all of them that have this communication problem. I would say that Zara K, Mohammed Syed, and Sarah Hayter are pretty congenial. And, they obviously have huge followers, so it's expected that I don't really get many responses from them. But people like Armin and Ali A. Rizvi, Ali A. Rizvi actually commented towards me once, just assumed that I was some right-wing fanatic because I disagreed with him on his arguments against Robert Spencer, since he said that Robert Spencer basically couldn't have a right to an opinion because he also believed in make-believe, and therefore his criticisms against Islam aren't really credible because he has his own fantasies regarding Christianity that he believes in. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, what about an ex-Muslim Christian? Do they suddenly not have any right to criticize their former religion, especially if, say, family members are trying to kill them? Like, Ali A. Rizvi should know better than this. This is basic stuff. I mean, I have no Muslim background in me, and I know better than this. How on earth can... I don't understand how Ali A. Rizvi could honestly make that argument. And, I mean, I've been told, like, oh, maybe I'm misinterpreting. Maybe Ali A. Rizvi, like, meant it to point out, just the hypocrisy and so forth. But hypocrisy is not a valid point. I'm sorry to say. You can call anything, any learning experience where you change your ways, hypocrisy. It's never a valid argument. I'm just saying. And it's used so... It's just used far too often to really apply to anything in a concrete manner, I would say. So, regarding the treatment of, say, religious people who believe in secular values and who want to support them, it honestly feels like they've just traded Islam for atheism and given the status of dhimmis to Islamic religious groups. Like the perception that these people are lesser and their views don't matter and they're just trying to get at us or use us or harm us. This conspiratorial mindset that they point out that Muslims may sometimes have because of their closed communities. They seem to exhibit it too, honestly, but in this case they've traded Islam for atheism, or for an extreme variety of atheism. Some of them are anti-theists, but even then, they seem to just regard any honest attempts at criticism or dialogue from a religious person who might want to financially back them as just ignorance, stupidity, and so forth. They don't value it at all. And I can personally attest to this, considering I've over a 7-month, actually over a 10-month period, according to an email, personally donated approximately like $50 to $100 monthly, depending on the month. Sometimes it was more, sometimes it was less, sometimes it was just 25, but for the most part it averaged around like 50 to 100 to ex-Muslims of North America, and it honestly felt like I was just being ignored when I'm trying to discuss things. Like, I would, for 7 months, shared the article showing that, the Indian National Congress Party really does support Sharia, and this is dangerous. I even had a conversation with one of the people internally, and shared the news article with them by email, and they still supported the Indian National Congress Party, which would be damaging for primarily Muslim women, including children 9 years of age, for obvious reasons, but also, of course, ex-Muslims in India. I don't understand that at all. When I brought that topic up with Harris Sultan, it seemed to me like from the Twitter feed of ex-Muslims of North America, like they stopped supporting the Indian National Congress Party. From what I understand, Harris Sultan, is in contact with fellow ex-Muslims, and they've had retreats together, like say at that European photo op, and build ex-Muslim communities. That's part of what they do for people who've lost their Muslim communities. So I would assume they're in contact, and it seems to me like the opinion is thereby valued when an ex-Muslim internally gives their views, but if it's an atheist of a different background or someone who's perceived as religious, the opinion isn't valued. Like, I spent over 7 months sharing that news article, explaining in detail Twitter, Facebook, multiple times, and even on their personal email, where I sent it, it did not seem that they were listening, at least to the best of my knowledge. It did not seem like they were listening at all. I'm not trying to discourage, say, financially supporting them. That's partly why I was afraid of making this video. Like, I'm not saying you shouldn't financially support them if you think they're doing good work. Like, they're probably dealing with cases of ex-Muslims trying to leave their family homes who might credibly and honestly be in danger even in the West. So you have to always keep that in mind. That is the most important aspect. What I'm speaking of here probably falls into the category of internet melodrama. So I apologize if that takes away from the important work that they're most likely doing and focusing on. I myself, I do feel like what I'm pointing out here is important, but when I consider the possibility of them losing out on funds because of a video I make, even though I don't think it's going to be all that popular or interesting, I worry that it could have a negative consequence for someone whose life could be in danger, honestly. So, yeah. So, the final criticism, I don't think they really seem to understand that Islam is leagues worse than any other religion, with the exception of perhaps Catholicism in modern times, since Catholicism is an overglorified pedophile ring. And I've said that, I will keep saying it, I will point it out whenever necessary. That's primarily because, for the most part, Islam has the death penalty for leaving. And it's right in the Quran that a Muslim has to kill anyone who leaves the faith. Most Western Muslims don't do this, but non-Western Muslims, ex-Muslims would not be living in danger in all these Muslim countries if this was not still prevalent. And it obviously still is. And unfortunately, the Western media has lied so thoroughly about the problems of Islam that it took me years just to unlearn all the nonsense that the Western media taught. Like the ex-Muslims of North America normalizing dissent tour videos, those were very helpful because I didn't realize just how thoroughly the Western media had lied. And it really came as a shock to me, because I had believed that the information they were giving was credible and that people like Sam Harris were being extreme in what seemed like anti-Muslim bigotry. But then it turned out like, no, you do have to separate, Islam from Muslims, and the level of lies on FGM, killing apostates, even the 72 virgins, which the Western media tried to at some point argue that it was raisins or something, or grapes. It's ridiculous. They weren't credible. They were losing credibility with me over things like Occupy Wall Street and Hillary Clinton's campaign, and even before that with basically being PR for corporate America. But that one, I realized like it went further back. The lies went further back than I thought. Like they should have the most credible information possible, but then they go and support the narratives of the most nonsensical of belief systems because it's a religion, so it gains special status. The final part for all this is that this is probably going to be the most controversial, but the standard that Islam sets, killing anyone who leaves, I don't believe that anyone, regardless of how they were brought up, regardless of their beliefs, I don't believe that anyone who would, say, mutilate or kill their own child for leaving Islam, and there are plenty of shared videos and depictions from ex-Muslims on Twitter regarding these very serious issues. But I don't believe that anyone who does that, especially to their own child, or even their niece, nephew, whatnot, ever truly loved that person. I don't believe that there was any real family love. This is probably going to be the most controversial thing that I say here. But I'm of the opinion that when a lot of these normalizing dissent videos show, the narcissistic, or explain the narcissistic behavior of some of these families, I think, in all honesty, there was never any love between the families to begin with if they decide to kill their own children over religion. That might be deeply hurtful to say, but I believe it's the truth. And this whole idea that, Muslims just have these very horrible ideas in their head, but they're actually good people, and this diffusion between anti-Muslim bigotry and Muslim behavior because of their faith in Islam is a lot more murky and gray than ex-Muslims would like to believe. They seem to have this idealized view that sharing the truth will eventually create open dialogue and either defang Islam or get rid of Islam. But most people aren't really interested in the truth. They're just interested in feeling good about themselves. And some people, when I criticize arguments, whether they're Muslim, Christian, Hindu, whatnot, they seem to argue that faith has nothing to do with human rationality, which is ridiculous to me. But they seem to honestly believe this. So it actually reminded me of this study conducted where atheists were shown to have higher IQ when religion was viewed as an instinct, and it makes more sense to view it as an instinct in the context of faith having nothing to do with human rationality. Like, I don't believe that is true, but if you, as a person, believe that, then I don't see why it wouldn't fit the definition of instinct, an instinct that you were ingrained with and conditioned into by your background. And given that context, and if you really believe that it has nothing to do with rationality, then I don't see how we can move forward in any sort of conversation or dialogue, or if anyone really even values it. And that kind of mindset makes it awkward to even talk about ex-Muslim human rights, because I think then you have to acknowledge that the religious faith, is more about human reason than it is about this idealized form of you'll believe it no matter what you think, which is pure anti-intellectualism. That's the only way I can describe it. It's pure anti-intellectualism. You don't use your human reasoning faculties for your faith. If that is the case, you're choosing not to think. But regardless of that, regardless of how certain religious people view it, Islam is too dangerous to allow it to spread, and I don't find that ex-Muslim groups are being honest with themselves enough to really tackle these challenges. Like, whenever they talk about geopolitics, such as Kashmir, if Kashmir were to go to Pakistan, there are two things that would happen. First, Al Qaeda would have a more controlled central base of operations where they could spread terrorism more globally, with the specific purpose, Al Qaeda's specific purpose, is to kill as many Americans as possible. And that, of course, includes Westerners in general. It doesn't have to be Americans specifically, as I'm sure many of them are ignorant about the differences with Western culture and so forth. But that can't be allowed. Second thing would be China could take it over right from under Pakistan, who, because Pakistan owes China a huge amount of debt. So they could gain control, and they could start spreading those concentration camps into Kashmir. The way I look at it is, it's secular. It's the secular Republic of India, or Islamist Pakistan, or concentration camps of China. I don't think that ex-Muslims are being realistic about any of this, judging from what I've seen of their commentary. I don't believe that they are really trying to fight Islam if they're trying to argue that more Islamic countries should gain territory and spread their Islamic values, including countries like Pakistan, where there are terrorist cells like Al Qaeda and other whole number of groups that we don't even fully know about on a regular basis. If they were to gain that territory and spread those Islamic values, then are ex-Muslims really serious about spreading secularism and secular values across the world? Because at that point, it's quite clear that they have never been serious about these issues. They have never been serious about the cost benefits of what it entails. They will never be serious. And they are instead on a moral high horse, being nihilistically pessimistic about any sort of news that doesn't conform to their idealized views of the world. And the fact that so much of the liberal media is giving sympathy to Pakistan, where religious minorities are treated like human garbage, makes me think that these people aren't really understanding what would happen if we no longer had the military might to defend ourselves from terrorist groups, which is insane to think that they don't really understand what that would mean, even though you can see what happens in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kashmir too, and all these other places, or just the Middle East. You don't even have to go to South Asia, just the Middle East itself. So I don't think that, based on the responses to even that, that people like Arben Navabi and other ex-Muslims are really taking in the dangers seriously. We will not be the greatest and strongest military capable of defending ourselves. And it's not because of Enlightenment values that we are so powerful. It is because of our military might. And as soon as that military might flips, we are going to get killed. And we can't allow that as a civilization, as a global civilization. That is, bar none, the absolute worst thing that could happen in terms of human progress, human rights, Enlightenment values, and to view view India as some sort of juggernaut all the time, or to view the West, like the United States or Europe, as juggernauts that can change the situation and control for all these factors, seems incredibly naive. We're losing. We have been losing. We're continuing to lose. And the situation could flip to the point where we are no longer able to defend ourselves, especially considering the U.S. economy in its debt, or other factors such as Europe's banking crises that don't get enough news focus. But I'm just saying, you have to keep that in mind. The West isn't always going to be the juggernaut, and it's rapidly decreasing faster than people realize. Donald Trump has done a lot to basically degrade U.S. capabilities across the world with his flimsy, flip-flopping decision-making. It's great that he had the Howdy Modi event, for example, but that's few and far between, and you can't expect him to be consistent on any issue anyway. So for anyone discussing poor oppressed Kashmiris, poor oppressed Rohingya, poor oppressed Syrians, and so forth, honestly consider, seriously think about this. What would happen if the guns were on the other side? What would happen if our military was weaker than their caliphate? What would they do to us? What would their intentions be if they held the reins of power? I'm sorry. I really am. But I can't support the human rights of people who want to kill me, who want to kill my entire family, who want to kill my country, who wish us the worst of harms, who join with Al-Qaeda, whose specific goal is to kill as many Americans as possible. I'm not going to have sympathy for people who join with groups like that. That is not immoral to say. That is not shameful to say. Whether it's the Kashmiris or even the Uyghur Muslims who joined with Al-Qaeda to take a plane and crash into a Chinese economic center. The Western media doesn't even discuss that. What is that? Uyghurs were working with Al-Qaeda, a group formed specifically to kill as many Americans as possible. And we're supposed to have sympathy? We're supposed to feel emotionally bad for all the horrible things done to them when they agreed with a terrorist group that wants to kill Americans. You could argue it's only a few Rohingya, it's so on and so forth. China is not doing this to all the Rohingya. And I'm not trying to justify concentration camps, but we have to be realistic. If the gun was on the other side, we would not even be having all these emotional conversations. We would not be having all this sympathy. We would be getting killed, slaughtered like lambs, similar to the Khmer Rouge's extermination. That's what would happen. Death squads. And if they even entertain the idea of working with groups like Al-Qaeda, then we need to be more wary of them and less sympathetic. Otherwise, we could end up getting killed. We could end up losing our military might at some point. And if the tables are turned, what's going to happen? am not trying to justify any sort of human rights abuses with this, but I have far less sympathy for people who are going to work with groups like that. And that's rational, and that's perfectly fine to say, and should be. It should not be controversial. I don't understand all this sympathy mentality for these kinds of groups, because really, they agree with a terrorist group specifically trying to kill us and who committed 9/11. So why are we having all these news media outlets streaming around about sympathy for these poor oppressed Muslims everywhere who specifically agree with wanting to kill Westerners in Kashmir, in the Uyghur territory that China holds? The Uyghur populated territory that is China's. You have to keep that in mind all the time. If the shoes were on the other side of the foot, they would not care what they would do to us. And it bothers me that we can't even talk about this. That the media shuts this down too. They don't even point this out, that these people have these values of wanting to kill Westerners. So I'm pretty sure that was the most controversial thing to say. I'm not sure if that would be part of some sort of hate for Muslims. I honestly don't know. I don't know anymore. But regardless, atheism is not a strident pro-enlightenment anti-theistic viewpoint. Atheism is a non-belief, and as a non-belief, there's no such thing as doing it right or wrong. So, as a Hindu atheist, this is where I disagree with the Western ExMuslim community, by and large.